Before purple aliens snapped half our world into ash, before the adorable dancing tree people, and even before we witnessed Robert Downey Jr. take his first flight as Iron Man, setting up a world that would eventually become the biggest ongoing movie franchise of all time, we had a serious vampire problem.
Vampires. They're everywhere.
With confirmation of beloved Hollywood actor Mahershala Ali taking on the role as Blade and making his way into the MCU, what better time is there to revisit Marvel's first big screen outing since...
Howard, pull up!
Around this time, comic book films had been going through a complete overhaul in Hollywood as movies like Tim Burton's Batman and Wes Craven's Swamp Thing were being traded for more lucrative toy opportunities like Joel Schumacher's Batman Forever and Batman and Robin. And while all of these films have their place in the hearts of comic book movie fans, the late 90s were no place for bat credit cards and villainous ice puns. At least not for the folks at New Line Cinema. The year is 1998, and times for cape and tight superhero movies were different. Until we got this.
He makes the weapons. I use them. It's open season on all suckheads. Blade.
This trailer blew minds through the screens of many households, and it got people talking. The trailer featured a much darker take on the comic book movies that we were used to seeing. The colors were high in contrast and dark, the visuals were edgy and certainly scary in the way that they portrayed vampires, and even featured a song that would go on to grace the households of many teenagers in 1998, Confusion by New Order. This preview captured the attention of comic book and horror fans and aroused an interest in moviegoers across the globe. Was this a horror film? Was this a superhero film? A vampire action thriller? Well, yes, and oh yeah.
You're one of them, aren't you?
No. I'm something else.
Now, at this time, comic book movies weren't exactly the big box office draw that they are today. But that didn't matter to Stephen Norrington and David S. Goyer, as the duo were hard at work in bringing to life the gothic and nocturnal world of Blade. Before becoming the money-making juggernaut, no pun intended. Actually, pun very intended. Marvel actually had some frequent financial struggles and had to resort to selling off its IP to various studios in Hollywood. Among this lineup was Blade, a half-human, half-vampire whose motivation stems from a vampire attack on his mother during her pregnancy with him.
Can't wait to meet up with Daddy again.
While the movie certainly takes its share of liberties in changing some of Blade's origin, there are some similarities that are transferred directly from the page to the screen. Today, we're going to revisit the 1998 hit that opened the doors for the MCU to exist today. But where did it all start? Find out in today's episode of our brand new series, Marvel Revisited. Blade's comic book origins began with Marv Wolfman and Gene Colan in 1973 as Blade made his first appearance in The Tomb of Dracula. While Blade originally didn't have the exact same power set as his movie counterpart, the Blade that most of us have come to love and expect is more closely related to the dark and stoic version that we get in the film. When the idea of a live-action Blade movie first came out, it was originally pictured as a Western film set in Mexico and was supposed to star Richard Roundtree as the titular Daywalker.
Are you out of your damn mind?
Later, rumors that rapper LL Cool J taking on the role began circulating and even yielded some interest from the artist. Eventually, the rights ended up in the hands of New Line Cinema, who commissioned a script from David S. Goyer, who had just come off of writing Dark City and the previously released TV movie Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. Goyer delivered a pitch that was not what the studio had in mind. David Goyer was able to convince the studio to go from developing Blade as a satirical parody on vampire films to giving it the dark and postmodern vampire story that unfolds in the theatrical cut of the film. After failing to get a Black Panther project off the ground, Wesley Snipes was offered to star as Blade, and who could have predicted the massive success he was going to find with this character? I mean, could you imagine all those movies with LL Cool J instead of Wesley Snipes? Neither could we.
If you think you cannot ride
me. Yeah, boy, I bet.
So now, with a talented team of filmmakers working with New Line Cinema to produce Blade, it was time for the supporting cast to be established. The role of Whistler, which many think adds a genuine sense of heart and soul to this movie, was originally planned for Jon Voight, and director Stephen Norrington even considered Patrick McGoohan, as he was a fan of The Prisoner. There also seems to be a Mandela effect where some people imagined Jeff Bridges as Whistler as a kid and didn't realize that it was actually Chris Christopherson for the longest time, but the performance was exceptional, and it should not be forgotten how well the dynamic worked between Blade and Whistler. In fact, it's similar to Batman and Alfred and their relationship, and it works really well in this movie. We also get Stephen Dorff as our main villain, Deacon Frost, which has to be the most 90s villain name ever, and we get the beautiful and talented Nabush Wright as Karen, a victim-turned-sidekick whose chemistry and medicine skills prove her to be a very valuable asset to Blade and Whistler's operation. The movie began production in 1997 in Los Angeles, while some shooting was done in Death Valley. This movie had a budget of $45 million, which was not a lot compared to movies like Men in Black, which came out around the same time and was a similar movie and had a $150 million budget. The story follows Blade on a mission to help clear up underground vampire crime activity in the city, while also following Deacon Frost, the movie's villain, as he tries to find a way to eliminate the human race and cure vampires of their many traditional weaknesses. When Frost discovers that Blade's blood is the key to summoning the Blood God in order to kick off a vampire apocalypse, Blade, Karen, and Whistler must hurry to save the human race from these suckheads, was it?
You tell him it's open season on all suckheads.
Sometimes it's easy to forget just how well this movie is put together, especially considering that superhero and comic book movies were not being widely praised like they are today. The film was a risk that cost New Line less than most movies of the genre, but went on to make their money back and then some, with an astounding box office turnout of $133 million, which is actually the lowest grossing Blade theatrical release to date, but still a box office success, and it would go on to warrant 2 subsequent films. The cinematography of this movie is extremely well done, and it's rare to see comic book movies these days that have so much style and flair from the filmmaker. This movie uses things like the slow push-in, dramatic close-ups, incredible environment establishing shots, and of course, who could forget that wonderfully convincing 1990s CGI. In revisiting this film, you can't help but notice the many similarities between Blade and Batman, which probably hadn't really been considered at the time, but it really is kind of a consistent thread in the film. There are clear parallels to The World's Greatest Detective and Blade, as both are cold, stoic characters who don't seem to feel much outside of their motivation to avenge their loved ones. But Blade cares, and I mean genuinely cares, about Whistler. Whistler plays the role of the father figure to Blade and keeps him on the human side of his constant battle between man and beast. He's tough, gruff, and the only humanity left in him is dedicated to the memory of his lost wife and daughters who were tragically murdered by a vampire. See, Blade and Whistler share a trauma. Or at least, they think they do. Blade's motivation for his heroics and dangerous vampire hunting shenanigans can be traced back to his mother, who was attacked by a vampire and died while giving birth to her half-vampire son. Well, this movie plays on our hero's motivation when it's discovered that Blade's mother is very much alive and hasn't aged a day. It's revealed that Blade's mother was turned into a vampire by Deacon Frost on the night of the attack. In fact, Deacon Frost committed the attack. This connects Blade to our villain in a much deeper and more complicated way. This film offers us stakes, and that's something that's hard to do in movies these days because the world can only almost end so many times. But we get to follow a character who's broken but hopeful. Blade never comes across as welcoming or friendly, to be sure, but he also doesn't hide behind a tough guy persona. He's noticeably distraught when Frost almost kills an innocent little girl, and he doesn't hide his sadness when he witnesses Whistler's final moments. This movie almost never gets mentioned in the list of best 90s movie villains, but I think that there is something to be said for the way David Goyer wrote the character of Deacon Frost. Frost comes off as your typical 1990s edgelord bad guy, but within the context of this film, he is the perfect bad guy. Stephen Dorff looks like he could be the frontman of any one of your dad's favorite bands, and fans would not have it any other way. The character may seem like a typical villain in today's cape-crazy world, but Deacon Frost is multi-dimensional in this movie in a way that goes largely unnoticed. He's sort of the rascal of his vampire litter in that he's not a natural-born vampire. To him, this causes a constant feeling of insecurity, which causes Frost to both resent and eventually destroy his fellow vampire race. The character also sees humans as beneath him, and he often refers to them as cattle, which really shows us just how far removed he is from his previous life as a human, but he doesn't feel accepted by natural-born vampires, so he's really the perfect outcast. And in some cases, fans have said he's not a villain at all, but the hero of his own story.
He was f***ing with me, man. He was like a fucking...
Seeing that the movie predates The Matrix, it is shocking how good the fight choreography and gunplay are. I really enjoyed the action considering the limited technology for CGI, but it did cause this movie to have to do a lot of things for real and with practical effects, which you just don't see enough anymore. And speaking of CGI, the special effects in this movie are dated, to say the least, but there really is a lot to appreciate in the makeup department as far as the look of the vampires, and in particular, the makeup and special effects work done on the character of Pearl. Now, this image haunted the dreams of our childhood, but rewatching it again, it's only now that we can appreciate just how special this character feels within the context of this movie. Pearl is the record keeper for the criminal underground of vampire activity, and he is also the most physically dramatic character in this movie. Pearl is only in one scene, but this character makes a difference in the way that we view the vampire underground in this movie. Pearl is heavy, dirty, ugly, immobile, and clearly isolated. He doesn't look like other vampires, he doesn't really act like other vampires, and he's just a big blob of monster guts, and fans went nuts for it. Let's petition for a Pearl solo movie. Comment in the comments if you're down. The ending of this movie definitely delivers a satisfying conclusion to the story and pretty much bookends the whole thing so that it's implied that Blade continues hunting vampires and even travels as far as Russia to take down some ugly, night-walking bloodsuckers that were lifted straight out of our nightmares. It is very nice to see a Marvel movie that is set in its own continuity and doesn't have a post-credit scene that connects it to a larger universe, while still having the open option for another film.
Blade 2.
Of course, when we get Mahershala Ali as Blade in the MCU, I'm sure we will see him introduced in a cameo or post-credit scene, but that doesn't seem to stop Blade fans from getting truly excited and curious about what he will bring to this brutal vampire hunter.
As it is revealed with your voice off screen that you are going to be Blade in the MCU.
Overall, this movie really holds up in all the right ways. The actors give us genuinely good performances. The writing was complex and dark, the characters were multidimensional, and the use of practical effects really saved this movie's ability to be rewatched and taken seriously in today's world of CGI. I mean, nowadays CGI is so good you can do an entire movie in CGI and they just call it live action anyway. The film's soundtrack also made its way into the mainstream of pop culture at the time by cracking the top 50 of the Billboard 200, featuring hip-hop and R&B tracks that blend through the late 90s into the early 2000s. Originally, the British techno group The Prodigy was asked to do the original motion picture soundtrack, but the band had a contractual obligation and had to work on a different project during that time. However, the music that we did end up getting is wonderful, and fans of the movie are still fans of the soundtrack today. Blade was a huge hit, people loved it, but sadly, Stephen Norrington denied the chance to return as director for the sequel, even despite the film's success at the box office. Instead, Norrington found himself teamed up with Sean Connery on the set of a big screen adaptation of Alan Moore's graphic novel, The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen.
You're an idiot, you know that?
Where he discovered that not all screen legends are gentlemen, or easy to work with. After the release of The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, critics were not impressed and the film was widely panned. It was ultimately not received well by critics or fans, and Norrington even stated that he had so many issues working with Connery on the movie that he would never direct another movie again.
Now walk away, you stupid son of a bitch.
He later changed his mind and said he would be open to making a return to cinema, but here we are in 22 and there's no sign of a comeback on the horizon for the once promising and well-received filmmaker. Unfortunately for many movie fans, we may not see another movie directed by Stephen Norrington, but we will always have films like Blade to remind us of all the wonderful films that could have been. And as all clouds have a silver lining, all box office hits have sequels. After the release of Blade in 1998, New Line Cinema was bursting with anticipation for the next installment in their newly found box office goldmine. Hollywood in this era was beginning to recognize the power that comic book movies held in live-action form, and the general consensus of audiences showed that darker material with more adult content was the key to our hearts and wallets. While fans of the MCU are impatiently waiting for Mahershala Ali's portrayal of the day-walking vampire hunter, it can be said with confidence that Blade 2 is the best on-screen representation of the character that we've seen to date.
Blade 2.
After getting our first taste of blood in Blade 1998, audiences were looking forward to seeing where Blade's journey would take him. Of course, studios don't just create a money-making, mind-blowing, dark and gritty noir nightscape like Blade without making immediate plans for sequels and spin-offs. But who could have predicted that in the spring of 2002, we would find ourselves completely encapsulated in the rare situation where the sequel is even better than the original? All of that and a bag of O negative coming up in today's episode of Marvel Revisited. Blade's original director, Stephen Norrington, declined the opportunity to return to the helm as he'd taken on the problematic and seemingly cursed project that would ultimately drive Norrington into early retirement: Alan Moore's The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen.
You've done terrible things in England. So terrible that you fled the country.
And while it is sad to see such a promising director fall victim to the fatigue of blockbuster filmmaking, it did force New Line Cinema to seek a new director for the highly anticipated sequel. This one decision from New Line would ultimately lead to the success or failure of the film. With Stephen Norrington out, acclaimed Mexican filmmaker Guillermo del Toro signed on to direct and adapt a screenplay written by David Goyer, who'd also written the first film. Today, you might know Guillermo del Toro from such films as Hellboy, Pan's Labyrinth, Nightmare Alley, and of course, The Shape of Water.
And the Oscar goes to Guillermo del Toro.
But at the time, Del Toro's credits were much less robust as he had been directing low-budget horror films like Mimic and The Devil's Backbone. Del Toro's filmmaking style was unique and easily recognizable by fans of his previous works. And for film lovers everywhere, the announcement that Guillermo del Toro would be directing was a very good sign. With glowing endorsements from Goyer and producer Peter Frankfurt, it was time to enter the production on the long-awaited Blade 2. According to the filmmakers, Blade 2 began its pre-production in 1999 with a script that initially included things like time travel and the introduction of fan-favorite characters from the comics, Hannibal King and Michael Morbius. However, as the script was revised and edited, some of the elements fell out of favor due to restrictions in technology, as well as the decision to give Morbius his own film franchise, something that wouldn't happen for another 20 years.
Morbius.
This led to the writers developing a new story that would capture all of the fun of the first film while adding new layers to the greater story. The film picks up 2 years after the events of the first movie, and we are immediately greeted with a nice exposition intro sequence where we get to see dramatic close-ups of Blade gearing up for battle while he fills us in on everything we need to know from the previous movie and everything that's happened in between. There are a lot of different writing devices used throughout the movie to explain the context of the previous films, and this introduction scene is just a clean and simple way to catch audiences up on the details. It's effective to be sure, though if you're revisiting these movies back to back like I did, the intro sequence is just eye candy. Or is it? Blade 2 immediately retcons a major plot point from the first film, and that is the death of Blade's mentor/father figure, Whistler. During Blade 2's intro, Blade explains that Whistler is actually not dead, but rather turned from human to vampire and being held captive by the Vampire Order. The choice to bring Whistler back into the story was welcomed by audiences, though it did require some of the dialogue and footage to be altered in flashback sequences from the first film. The story begins with the introduction of a mysterious new threat as we see a vampire-owned blood bank being infiltrated by a nightmarish monster who seems to hate vampires as much as Blade does. This is interesting because it brings up a question that will become a common theme in this film. Who is the real enemy?
Is the enemy of my enemy my friend? Or my enemy?
Blade tracks and rescues Whistler, who is now a vampire, and returns him to his headquarters, where we're also introduced to Blade's new weapons designer and guy in the chair, Scud.
Tell me something, Skid.
No, man, it's Scud. Scud like stud, Scud.
Whatever.
Scud is a pothead technician who essentially fills the role of Whistler. He's played by Norman Reedus, who had just come off the release of the cult indie film Boondock Saints, but is best known for his recurring role on AMC's The Walking Dead as Daryl Dixon. Blade detoxes the bloodthirst from Whistler, essentially curing him of his vampirism and returning him back to the normal, wisecracking, rough and gruff character that audiences fell in love with in the first film. Chris Christopherson is just a joy to watch as Whistler, and he really amps up the vulgar quips and standoffish demeanor in this second film. With Whistler back to normal and a growing jealousy between him and Scud as they compete for Blade's favor, the big conflict of this movie is introduced when vampire overlord Eli Damaskinos sends a pair of acrobatic, sleek-suited vampires to find Blade and seek his help in tracking and killing a mutual enemy.
Whoa. Cool outfit.
Fans of Blade know that there is nothing Blade hates more than vampires. This made the second film a lot more interesting in that Blade is essentially being forced to team up with the thing he hates most in order to defeat something bigger that makes the war between humans and vampires seem very small in comparison. We find out that there is a new strain of vampirism called the Reaper strain. It's explained in the film as being a new variant of the vampire virus and causes the Reapers to hunt and drink vampire blood, which doesn't kill their victims, but infects them, creating more Reapers. Overlord Eli hypothesizes that once the Reapers are done mutating vampires, they'll have no choice but to turn to slaughtering humans. There's that theme of who's the enemy creeping its head again. Blade, despite his clear hesitation, decides to play along with the vampire order so he can get access and clearance deeper and deeper into the underground of vampire activity. He assembles a team of highly trained vampires who have spent 2 years training to hunt the best of the best in order to assist Blade, Whistler, and Scud in their mission. The gang is a group of mercenary vampires that consists of Nisa, played by Lenore Varela, who is not only a badass but also the daughter of Eli Damaskinos, the vampire overlord. As well, we get Chupa, Snowman, Priest, Lighthammer, and Reinhardt. Now, Guillermo del Toro is notorious for his specific style and aesthetic, and that is stamped all over the movie in subtle ways, from the design of the vampires to the set and costume designs, and even the presence of frequent Guillermo del Toro collaborator Ron Perlman.
Want anything done right, you gotta do it yourself.
Ron Perlman is great in this film, and seeing him in this role makes it really cool to see what he and Guillermo del Toro went on to do with the Hellboy franchise. There's a lot of similarities, but also a lot of differences. It's great. The dynamic of this team also works really well. There's a bit of love interest between Blade and Nissa, which is taboo in nature, seeing as Blade hates vampires. It adds a nice layer of sensitivity to the film that Karen filled in the previous movie. Snowman is the quiet type who clearly isn't here to make any friends, and Lighthammer looks like this. The team-up element of this movie feels very Suicide Squad-esque, and it really works within the context of the story. The team clearly hates Blade, and the feeling is obviously mutual, as Wesley Snipes' character and Ron Perlman's character have an ongoing tension and unfriendly back and forth, which is so much fun to watch, and you find yourself getting very invested in.
God, it'd be so easy.
Blade and his team have an epic early 2000s nightclub battle scene when they encounter a group of Reapers. The team discovers that Reapers are not only faster and stronger than the ordinary vampire, but they're also immune to many traditional vampire weaknesses. This information forces the team to work together in order to create a plan to triangulate, trap, and destroy the Reapers while taking out their leader, Patient Zero, Nomak. Nomak's origin and connection to the characters is ambiguous, but it's hinted at many times throughout the movie. When designing the vampires for this movie, fans were immediately able to recognize the differences between the first film and the second film. Guillermo del Toro went on record saying that he wanted vampires to be scary again. This is clear in the Nosferatu-style design for Eli and the Reapers, and the use of prosthetics and practical makeup blended with the limited CGI technology for the grosser details of these Reapers. And speaking of CGI limitations, if there is one thing that doesn't hold up upon rewatching this movie, it's the fully animated fight sequences that pop up throughout the movie. There's a handful of scenes that are done completely in CGI, which is pretty standard practice in superhero movies today, but at the time was much more tricky of a process to pull off. It doesn't really age well, but Guillermo del Toro is a genius when it comes to practical effects, so while some of the movie is pretty spotty in CGI, the practical effects definitely make up the bulk of the film. So the team has identified that UV light is the only thing that they can use to defeat the Reapers. This sends the squad into battle with a bunch of new high-tech UV light bombs. The team spreads out, which allows the pacing to slow down and focus on individual character conflicts and more intimate storytelling. It's here where some information is discovered, and one of the team members is turned from vampire to Reaper, which brings us nicely back into action. At this point, Blade's suspicion of the Vampire Order and the truce between them and Blade is confirmed as the team begins to turn on Blade and Whistler. We get to see the vampires getting kind of picked off one by one as they either kill themselves or kill each other or this. Whistler is confronted by Nomak, who explains that there is more to this conflict than the vampires are letting on, and even chooses to spare Whistler's life. It's discovered that Reapers were created by Overlord Eli in an attempt to create a more powerful and more invulnerable breed of vampires. Basically, Nomak was a failed experiment, and after being turned into a monster by Eli, he was seeking revenge on his creator. By this point, Blade and Whistler have been captured by the Vampire Order, and we get a payoff to an ongoing tension between Blade and Reinhardt. It's also revealed that Scud is working for the Order of Vampires and purposely led them directly to Blade and Whistler and kicked this whole thing off. Blade, being the brooding but brilliant vampire detective that he is, was prepared for this betrayal and planned ahead. The final battle is in effect and heads are gonna roll. Blade and Whistler escape their capture and begin individually kicking vampire ass with high-flying kicks, swashbuckling, and of course, a great soundtrack. Nessa unfortunately doesn't survive her encounter with Nomak as he bites her and infects her with the Reaper virus. Nessa, being Blade's love interest, completes her story by getting Blade to carry her into the sun to spend her final moments taking in the rays before turning into hot ash in Blade's arms. Whistler and Blade survive the whole ordeal, and the movie ends with a heroic smolder from our heroes. The ending of this movie just feels deserved. From the way it's written, this movie takes you on an exhausting journey to the finish line. You really feel the hours of labor put in by these characters, and by the time it's over, you're spent. There's no time jump to the next adventure, there's no setup for a big reveal in the next movie, there's no post-credit scene. It's a story that takes you to the brink and then ends. The rewatch of this film was very refreshing in that it's a self-contained film. You don't have to have seen the first film to understand what's happening, and you don't need to watch the next film for the payoff to anything established in this movie. It's like Guillermo del Toro knew that this would be his only Blade movie and decided to make it fit the ongoing narrative while also working as its own standalone feature film. It's like a slice of Guillermo del Toro history. While the first movie was primarily shot in Hollywood, this film shot at Prague Studios in the Czech Republic, as well as some shooting done in London, which amplifies del Toro's filmmaking gothic aesthetic even more. The film was released in theaters in March of 2002 and received mixed reviews from critics, saying that the direction, performances, and cinematography were excellent, but the number of characters made it difficult to have enough development for each of them. This didn't stop the movie from becoming a box office hit, as it brought in a home run return of $155 million off of just a $54 million budget.
Amen, brother.
It also saw a very good home video release, as they included some special features that really enticed fans of the film to purchase. The DVD included a deleted flashback scene where we see Blade first meeting Whistler, and I know people personally who have bought the DVD just to see it. It was 2002. Give him a break. After the success of this film, Guillermo del Toro went on to give massive praise to the cast and crew for the film's success, specifically giving praise to Wesley Snipes by saying, quote, "Wesley knows Blade better than David Goyer, better than me, better than anyone else involved in the franchise." And to this day, fans agree. Wesley Snipes had already given the performance of a lifetime with Blade, but this film further solidified him as the character. Similar to how fans see Robert Downey Jr. and Iron Man as one entity, the same can be said for Wesley Snipes and Blade.
You obviously do not know who you are f***ing with.
This movie really takes the best elements of the first film and amps them up to a bigger and better film. Wesley Snipes was clearly in his element in the movie as Blade, and he even feels more human than vampire while maintaining his intimidating and almost scary image. Blade does crack a few jokes, he gets some incredible quote-worthy lines.
Adolf here gets the first shot. Come on, what are you looking at her for? You need permission?
And as always, we can count on our stylish vampire hunter to be having an over-the-top action sequence that ends with the iconic Blade sunglasses catch. It's also worth mentioning that the soundtrack of this film was a success as well, which can also be said for the first movie. Blade 2 soundtrack cracked the top 50 on the Billboard 200 for that year, and the movie also got a video game counterpart, which was released in 2002 as well.
So exciting, isn't it?
This would help secure the third Blade film a significantly higher budget. But does bigger always mean better? It's no secret that ending a trilogy is no easy task. In fact, most beloved trilogies out there share one common characteristic. The third movie is usually the worst one. Whether it's due to the franchise overstaying its welcome, taking too long in between films and fading out of relevance, or just plain old bad luck. It usually seems like ending something is the true villain in any saga. Now for some, Blade Trinity is an acceptable conclusion to Wesley Snipes' turn as the Daywalker, but for others, the movie leaves a blade-shaped void in their Marvel headcanon. In either case, one thing is for sure, this movie has some significant highs and some very significant lows. Today's episode proves to be interesting as we dive into the final installment of the Blade trilogy, a movie that's been loved by some, hated by many, forgotten by most, and sued by one person, a movie that was arguably made just so Ryan Reynolds could test his ideas for Wade Wilson 13 years before the release of Deadpool. But how does this movie hold up against the epic spectacles of today's MCU? Let's find out in today's episode of Marvel Revisited. Hey there, true believers. Today we have a series first as we're wrapping up our first trilogy in the Marvel Revisited time capsule with Blade Trinity. Now, this movie has had its share of criticism to be sure, but when it comes to comic book movies of this era, we can look forward to plenty more where that came from. When the announcement was made by New Line Cinema that Blade Trinity would be directed by David S. Goyer, who had wrote the previous two movies, and would of course star Wesley Snipes again as Blade, the movie seemed to be in good enough hands and fans had their expectations set on high. According to David S. Goyer, he reached out to the previous Blade directors, Stephen Norrington and Guillermo del Toro, to get advice on how to proceed with the film and end the Blade saga. And fun fact, del Toro was actually thanked for his design contribution in the movie's credits. Before cameras even started rolling, Ryan Reynolds was being considered for a role in the film along with a planned spin-off movie. Some of that did come to fruition, of course, as we do see Ryan Reynolds in this movie and he basically plays a prototype Wade Wilson, but no spin-off ever came from his performance.
We had him!
The movie also stars Jessica Biel, who was actually not the studio's first choice. Originally, New Line wanted Ashley Scott for the movie, but she was beat out by Biel shortly before filming began. We also get an amazing supporting cast in Chris Christopherson, Parker Posey, Natasha Lyonne, Dominic Purcell, John Michael Higgins, and Triple H, for my pro wrestling fans out there.
Time to play the game!
Goyer said he wasn't sure about putting Triple H in his movie, but after seeing his audition and hearing his comedic talents, Goyer wrote some additional scenes for him to not only be in the movie, but in the movie even more. Something that didn't work for everyone.
You're kids. You're not ready to roll with this.
Apparently, Wesley Snipes was so unhappy with the finished version of the script that he would constantly refuse to shoot scenes and force Goyer to do reshoots with a stand-in. I'm telling you guys, there is all kinds of juicy controversies coursing through the veins of this production. I would highly recommend you watch our JoBlo original video, What the F Happened to Blade Trinity, to get your hands on the full story.
This is awkward.
Now, if you're ready, then so am I. So grab your darkest sunglasses and of course drop a like on this video and subscribe for the best in movie content. And let's hit play on Blade Trinity. The movie opens with some high-tech vampires in a remote desert in Syria as they search for the tomb of Dracula, the first vampire, and also the key to the next evolutional step in vampirism. They find the Prince of Darkness himself and bring his body back to their headquarters, and now it is time to catch up with Blade. Blade's introduction scene is exactly what viewers would hope for, a dark and grimy cityscape with Blade and Whistler hunting down vampires left and right. We also get a pretty visceral car chase and of course a wonderful techno soundtrack to instantly take you back to the feel of the previous movies. One thing that must be mentioned whenever we're discussing Blade Trinity is the instantly recognizable soundtrack. All three of these movies have had albums that came with their own acclaim, and it is definitely well deserved. So Blade finishes the hunt by shooting down what he thinks is just another night-crawling bloodsucker, but unfortunately...
Not a vampire, dumb shit!
Ooh, that's right, Blade gets tricked by the underground society of vampires and is now being hunted by the federal government as a wanted murderer. This, to me, is the most interesting concept introduced in this movie. I love the idea of a vigilante whose victims turn into ash, leaving no evidence behind, but then being set up to spear down a human in front of cops and cameras? Now that is something to write home about. Blade retreats back to him and Whistler's hideout, where we get some much needed Blade and Whistler time to remind us of just how strong their father and son bond really is.
I see you alone, surrounded by enemies, and it breaks my heart.
When the FBI locates Blade and Whistler, the pair have only seconds to destroy the evidence of their operation and attempt to flee. Now, I don't know what it is about this franchise feeling the need to kill Whistler every time we see him in a movie, but the heartbreak never lets up, guys. It's real, every single time. Whistler sacrifices himself for Blade, but Blade does not escape. And so much for the cool idea of having Blade in FBI custody, because Blade isn't captive very long before we're introduced to Abby, played by Jessica Biel, and Hannibal King, played by Ryan Reynolds.
This is supposed to be a rescue!
From the start, Reynolds is playing a sarcastic, smart-mouthed quip machine serial killer who's got tactical skills that rival anything we've seen in this franchise so far. Does any of that sound like Deadpool to you? Me too.
Fake laugh, hiding real pain.
In fact, Ryan Reynolds also provides some voice narration at the beginning and end of this movie, which, listening to it now, it is impossible not to just hear the voice of Wade Wilson.
In the movies, Dracula wears a cape, but everybody knows the movies are full of shit.
Abby and Hannibal are able to free Blade and give him a dose of his serum so he can regain strength, and the three of them battle their way out of the government agency they're being held in.
Forgot my sword.
So from here on out, it's not just a Blade movie, but it's a Blade and Night Stalkers movie.
Sounds like rejects from a Saturday morning cartoon.
We were gonna go with the Care Bears, but that was taken.
Now, while I can appreciate the concept of utilizing some solid comic book characters to add some balance to the stoic and silent Blade, in my opinion, this is where the movie becomes the most disappointing. See, I liked the idea of Blade being captured by the FBI and being forced to cooperate with them in order to clear his own name and defeat the bad guys. There's plenty of interesting ways you could introduce the Night Stalkers into that plot line, but instead Blade is freed immediately, and the entire middle section of this movie is just explaining the new characters that we get and having Blade adjust to working with yet another team. I'm not saying it's all bad though. In fact, I loved the cast here, and David Goyer did showcase their talents pretty well in this part of the movie.
I have a question about that, Hedges. Have you ever been laid?
Many times.
It's clear that there was a cool and fun action movie idea in here somewhere, but I find that there was just too many spinning plates and too many characters to juggle at this point in the movie, and it really suffers in the scenes that don't feature Blade slinging bullets and swashbuckling around. We do learn that Abby is Whistler's long-lost daughter, and Hannibal is an ex-vampire who had been cured by Abby. And the team is rounded out by Patton Oswalt as Hedges, the tech expert for the Night Stalkers, as well as Natasha Lyonne as Summerfield. This group of misfit vampire hunters aim to help Blade in destroying Dracula, who, by the way, is definitely not a huge part of this movie.
Dracula's only one of the names he's gone by. The Babylonians worshipped him as Dagon, and now they call him Drake.
Speaking of Dracula, maybe the biggest downfall that this film has is Dominic Purcell as Dracula, or I guess Drake as he's known in this movie. While Purcell has seen success in TV roles such as Prison Break and The Flash, this performance feels absolutely underdone but overdone at the exact same time. While borrowing some of Dracula's lore from Tomb of Dracula, which was Blade's first comic appearance, and I do really appreciate seeing that in the movie, the shape-shifting son of the devil himself was played as a boring, motiveless, hot topic-obsessed cult leader. Ugh.
What? You wanna kiss me, pretty boy?
Parker Posey plays Danica, a vampire leader with intentions to use Dracula's blood to enhance her species of vampire and eliminate all of their weaknesses. Kind of like the plot of the first movie, and kind of like the plot of the second movie.
I must have heard hundreds of you rodents make the same claim. Each one of them have tasted the end of my sword.
We also get acquainted with Danica's crew, including Jarko, played by Triple H. And he's honestly not doing his best acting in this movie, but I don't care. It's good to see him kick some ass for a while. This film spends a lot of time with the Night Stalkers and specifically the Trinity, Blade, Abby, and Hannibal. While I wish I could say I enjoy the time dedicated to this team and their dynamic, I actually find it to be some of the more boring and forgettable content within this movie. The pacing of the movie also struggles as it starts off with action and suspense for the first act, only to really drag through the second act and attempt to still keep us engaged for the third act.
My friends are going to kill you.
Most of the issues with the film, I think, are due to studio involvement and just having too many people with too many differing opinions on what this film should be. By the final act of this movie, Blade and Abby are gearing up to infiltrate Vampire HQ and rescue Hannibal, who had been kidnapped by the Bloodsuckers, and then they proceed to take out an entire building full of vampires, familiars, and...
Goddamn vampire Pomeranian?
Yes.
At this point in the movie's 2-hour runtime, all I want to see is Blade sword fighting and flipping off of walls while a killer techno soundtrack plays. And in that, this movie does deliver. Blade finally faces off against Drake in a really intense sword fight which takes Blade and Drake to their absolute limits. The sword fight is honestly pretty entertaining because of the speed and fast camera movement, and it's also nice to see Wesley Snipes getting to do some stunt work. I mean, it's never not awesome, you know what I mean? And just when you think Hot Topic Dracula got the best of Blade, Abby comes in to save the day. Kind of. It's clear in this scene that the studio really wanted Blade to be the one to defeat Dracula, because Abby shoots the Dracula killing serum through an arrow at hundreds of miles an hour right at Dracula, but he senses it and catches it without any effort. But then Blade just picks up the arrow and stabs him in the stomach with it, which he could somehow not sense was coming even though it was happening right in front of him. I don't know. I don't f***ing know. The police show up right as the vampires and Drake are dying, leaving behind nothing but piles of ash as evidence. The police find what they think is Blade's body, only to find out moments before they slice into the body for the autopsy that it is in fact the dead corpse of Dracula, who had shapeshifted into Blade at the last minute. And this definitely does not track with the terms and logic that this movie sets up, but it's better than Blade actually being dead, right? We get a final shot of Blade doing a wheelie on his motorcycle while Ryan Reynolds narrates that Blade is still out there and ready for whatever comes next. Oh yeah, and there's also a post-credit scene which technically adds exactly nothing to this movie. It's literally just a silent clip of Blade driving, and that's it. Blade Trinity was released on December 4th, 2004, and while it did open fairly strong with $52 million in its opening weekend, it ultimately failed to gross as much as Blade 2.
Didn't know this was a popularity contest.
The film was considered a success, however, as it ended its box office lifetime with $132 million on just a $65 million budget. The film has received generally negative reviews from critics and audiences and currently holds a 25% on the tomato meter, if you care about that sort of thing. Wesley Snipes also filed a lawsuit against the studio and the director about his salary and screen time. Snipes himself would later be sued by his own talent agency for not paying them. How ironic.
Like I care.
Years later, Goyer would comment about the film saying, quote, "I don't think anyone involved in that film had a good experience on that film. I certainly didn't. I don't think anyone involved with that film is happy with the results. It was a very tortured production." Of course, this would cause New Line Cinema to cancel the planned Hannibal and Abigail spin-off, which would have been a film following the Night Stalkers. Personally, I would love to see a Night Stalkers movie, but I'm glad the one that was planned for this universe was ultimately scrapped. And while Ryan Reynolds may have been a bit disappointed with the cancellation of his movie, he would shortly after find another chance to play a wisecracking superhero with his performance as Wade Wilson in X-Men Origins Wolverine. A movie that I will no doubt have to revisit one of these days, and by this point, you all should know just how excited I am to watch it.
And that's basically turning a frown upside down.
Blade Trinity was an interesting ride. I found myself really enjoying the introduction back into this world for the first half hour, but then became very bored and slightly disappointed throughout the rest of the movie. While it is indeed a mixed bag for me, I still found plenty of things to appreciate within this film. I can't in any way say it's a bad movie, and of course, some people out there find it to be a very good movie. Have you seen it lately? What did you think of it? Comment below. Of course, we're also getting closer and closer to our long-awaited MCU Blade outing starring Mahershala Ali, a film that I've heard is having its own issues with production. Are Blade movies just cursed or what? What's going on here? We've got so much more to cover here on the show, so as always, be sure to like, subscribe, and make sure you tune in next time for Marvel Revisited. We'll see you again soon.
You